Here are 17 data points in about 17 minutes. And thank you, Chris, for continuing to talk, and Myron for stepping in with a little exercise and reminding us of the importance to nurture ourselves. First of all, a brief history and update of KSAP research, which Myron's going to touch on a bit also. In 1999, the Advisory Committee on Clergy Candidacy and Clergy Assessment began to be approached by an increasing number of annual conferences with this question: is there a way to determine if a candidate for ministry is likely to be effective in ministry, and if so, is there an instrument that would measure it? It took us about 30 seconds in that meeting to say no to both of those questions. At that point in time, and it's also true now, most boards of ministry had and have opinions about what constitutes effectiveness, and those opinions vary widely across boards of ministry, and they're largely anecdotal, and they're largely kind of pet lists of what we have decided is effectiveness. And so at that point in time, the late 1990s, the advisory committee looked around at other denominations and found absolutely no empirical-based outcome research in any denomination regarding clergy effectiveness. And the last time we checked, this research is still the only empirical outcome-based research available in any denomination. And so in 1999, the committee engaged Rick DeShawn, professor of industrial organizational psychologist at Michigan State University, and he moved his research through three important stages that eventually identified 64 KSAPs, knowledge, skill, ability, and personal characteristics, and task clusters. And then, more recently, ranked the top 13 task clusters and KSAPs. And should you be interested in the statistics behind that, if you go to the GBHM website, and just type in effectiveness research, that 80 or 90-page document should come up, and you can see the statistics behind the ranking. And those are the task clusters by rank, as you may be familiar with if you've been in any earlier presentations: communication, preaching and public worship, self-development, caregiving, management, other development, evangelism, fellowship, administrative, relationship building, rituals and sacrament, United Methodist connection, and facility construction. There are very careful definitions in that research document that fine line what each of these terms mean. And then the KSAPs, and parenthetically, you see whether it falls under knowledge, skill, ability, or personal characteristic: trusting God, integrity, authenticity, oral communication, theology and scripture, dependability, calling, time management, reading comprehension, intelligence, spiritual disciplines, administrative, and management principles. These slides are on the website, so it would be easy enough for you to pull them up. Nancy? Knowledge, skill, ability, and personal characteristics. Now, what we're very interested in, and we do not have data on, is a linkage analysis between KSAPs and task clusters. That is, which of these task clusters most need which of these KSAPs. And so a very critical next step of the research to be carried out is the importance of linking the KSAPs with task clusters. Without that, you have a kind of shotgun approach in that we know that effective clergy carry out these task clusters, and effective clergy embody these KSAPs, but we also know that certain KSAPs are more important for particular kinds of task clusters. And so, if we can move forward to do the task KSAP task linkage analysis, it'll do several things for us in terms of making this a much more usable instrument. It will provide crucial data to understand how the KSAPs support each task cluster. And with that information, it will become possible to provide focused training and development experiences to identify weaknesses in a clergy person, as an example. And also, if a particular church has particular needs with respect to certain task clusters, data would be provided to help select a clergy person who has strengths on those KSAPs that support those particular task clusters. And so you can begin to see how the linkage analysis can be very important. And it will extend the usability of the KSAP assessment instrument that Myron will talk with us about in just a moment. Now, the committee also has asked a committee of Dr. Richard Hunt and Dr. Chris Adams and myself to develop a first stage model for looking at the use of assessing KSAPs and task clusters at different stages of formation into ministry, and also what testing instruments might be most useful at those stages. Increasing numbers of boards of ministry, as you know, assess candidates more than once and at different stages. The Virginia Conference seems to have had the first model to do that starting 14 years ago in the year 2000. The conference developed a three-stage model that assesses at the candidacy stage, the provisional stage, and the full member stage using different instruments at each of those stages. What follows is a first attempt at a three-stage model, and we welcome your input on the model. It's not an exhaustive model, it's suggestive, using the 13 ranked KSAPs and task clusters with suggestions of the kinds of instruments that may likely help do that assessment. Again, the instruments are not exhaustive, and we're not suggesting that all of the instruments be used, but that you could pick and choose among those instruments. And so, in terms of stage one, candidacy, fitness for ministry, the primary KSAPs that we're thinking about in that area are trusting God, integrity, authenticity, and intelligence. And the assessment instruments that we're thinking about are the personal reference form, the MMPI-2, the Milan, the MCMI-3, the Cattell version of the 16PF, the Shipley, which is an intelligence, short intelligence instrument, the Gottman marital inventory. Increasing numbers of denominations that we work with, where I am in Virginia, non-United Methodist, ask us to do an assessment of where a candidate is married, to do an assessment of the marriage. And John and Julie Gottmans out at the University of Washington, their marital inventory we've been using for 2 or 3 years now with 2 of the Episcopal dioceses to give the diocese and their committees a read on the marriage. Because one of the things we know is that transition, especially for second career people, but that transition if people are married, from the decision to not be in ministry to being in ministry, the progression into seminary, first appointment or assignment, etc., can be terrifically stressful on the marriage. And so we're interested in ways of protecting the marriage and insulating the marriage from those stresses. Board of Ministry papers and both clinical and DCOM and Board of Ministry interviews. Stage 2, the provisional stage, readiness for ministry. There we've begun to think about the KSAPs that ought to be measured as oral communication, theology and scripture, time management, reading comprehension, and spiritual disciplines. And they're looking as assessment instruments closely at seminary courses and grades that support those KSAPs, the CPI, the California Personality Inventory, Board of Ministry papers, and interviews. And this is a continuation under task clusters now for stage 2. looking at the task clusters of communication, fellowship, relationship building, rituals and sacrament, and United Methodist connection. They're using the 16 PF, the basic version of that, and then the possibility of 3 emotional competence, what am I wanting to say? IQ, emotional intelligence, emotional competence devices, the Boron Equi 360, the MESIT, and the ESCI. And also treating very seriously the CPE report, because there you have a candidate who's been in vitro, if you will, being observed by a supervisor in the supervisor's report on how that person has functioned in real time, what kinds of issues have come up, et cetera, to take that CPE report very seriously, and then in addition, the board of ministry papers and the interviews. And then finally, at stage 3, full membership for effectiveness, looking at the KSAPs of dependability, calling, administrative, and management principles. And they're considering instruments like the Strength Finder, the 16 PF, the Human Resource Development Report of the 16 PF, the Strength Deployment Inventory, because that's a very useful instrument that looks at how one does when things are going well, and then how one does when things are not going well. It gives a read on how the person handles moments of conflict, both going into it, during it, and afterwards. And then the board of ministry papers and interviews. And then under task clusters, preaching and public worship, self-development, caregiving, management, other development, evangelism, administrative, and facility construction. And they are using the edemic instrument that Myron will talk with you about in just a second, the leadership circle profile, which looks at both creative domains in a person's work as well as the reactive tendencies. What do we do in life that gets in the way of our creativity? To what degree are we overly compliant? To what degree are we overly protecting and distancing? To what degree are we overly controlling? And then the role of coaching in that, and then the board of ministry papers and interviews. So the first draft of a model to help us begin to think about the KSAPs and task clusters in a 3-stage model and how we might divvy those up and look at them in each of the stages and what instruments may be useful in the doing of that. And then finally, in terms of next steps, Dr. Hunt and Dr. Adams and I will soon begin a process of attempting to map particular KSAPs onto current psychological instruments so that we can begin to identify which of the KSAPs may show up in reliable ways on psychological instruments that we already have. And I think Dr. Hunt's going to probably talk about some of that tomorrow in a couple of sessions. Myron, with that,